It's a bit strange. I started my channel on War Thunder. Making content for the game over the course of several months did not seem like a strange prospect to me. In fact, many YouTubers who have become some of the most heard of voices in the War Thunder community also started with War Thunder and expected big things out of it. Now I plan on making different types of content, revolving around different subject matters, but it wasn't until 1.39 that I started to have doubts about the manner in which War Thunder was being developed. I, among others at the time, saw the newer progression system as a bit unnecessary. However, more details revealed led me to the conclusion that it could work if implemented correctly. So I held out for 1.41, waiting for an update that looked solely at the progression system and how planes were tiered in it. But that was the big old tank update. I held out until recently with 1.43, but that was the big old jet update. Several months of mudslinging, arguments amongst other members of the community, who also went out of their way to argue with me and anyone else who felt the way I did, the debacle with the forum staff and Averix plea to the CEO of the company, the CEO's apathetic response, and the creation of the player council have all culminated into one big patch that everyone was putting their hopes into, but that has simply led to more content. More stuff. So I put up another dumb video in response, and a lot of people respectfully stated that they liked 1.43 for the most part, despite its issues. But to me, that's odd, considering at least in the AAA industry, content updates weren't things people had reason to complain about, at least not things people had to look at and go, oh, well, I mean, there's a whole bunch of good stuff here, but there are some problems. Some wonder why, despite all the stuff that came with 1.43, the people still clinging to this game remain upset. I think it has to do with many specific examples, like silly flavor of the month planes with abnormally potent performance, and strange tier setups for a historical game, but I think those issues stem from a much larger issue. And I believe that issue, quite simply, is lack of focus. And lack of focus is what's killed many creative projects, be them video games, movies, or anything else. War Thunder is in the Guinness Book of World Records for a category that has to do with having a whole bunch of stuff. Gaijin seem proud enough of themselves to put that on the front page of their website, but this in itself is troubling. Mainly because many of the planes included in that number there have unfinished flight models, have been thrown in without proper flight models to be finished later, are repeats, and have been both victims and catalysts of power creep. I think this emphasis on having so much content in the game is ultimately what is skewing Gaijin's development priorities, and is what is making criticism and discussion about the game in its current state so difficult. As of now, you can go through several of the tech trees and find planes that are currently in wonky flight model states, have been in wonky flight model states, or are tiered strangely. America, a nation that used to be considered a bit more difficult to fly in arcade battles than others, now has some of the most under-tiered planes in the game, and now hosts a new flavor of the month, the Tiger Cat. Germany has been the subject of many flavors of the month, most of them being shut down within a few days or weeks, mind you, and is still left with skewed matchmaking for some of its N-tier jets, particularly the Me-262, and German tankers still have to deal with tanks like the T-50 and N-tier ground force vehicles like the goddamn motherfucking IS-4M. Russia has a very distinct early-tier advantage, and to a degree, a mid-tier advantage against Germans, with several planes like the I-16 Yak-1 and several others flying against planes they simply did not fly against during the war. While arguably baseless, I can totally see why someone would come to the conclusion that there is an element of it in games like World of Tanks, and particularly War Thunder. Britain is relatively balanced right now, but hosted its own flavors of the month and wonky, unfinished flight models, like the Spitfire Mark 9 and the Vampire, respectively. And Japan has, in many ways, been the least cared about nation in the game, with all-or-nothing balance changes and fixes that either put it in the position of seal clubbing American naval planes in certain events, or getting seal clubbed by B-17s. The strange part is that most of these issues with certain trees and planes could be fixed with a little bit of tweaking from whatever Excel sheets they have at the company, yet despite countless amounts of forum posts and videos from people in the community, many of those issues have been ignored completely. Instead, with each update to the game, rather than making an emphasis out of internal improvements, it's always something along the lines of more and more content.
Let's first discuss the new planes.
War Thunder ground vehicles are now available for all players in open beta testing. There are new aircraft, shading optimization and updated visual effects, and modified weapons and ballistics. Let's have a look at the new aircraft.
Nearly 20 new ground vehicles have arrived in the Ground Forces hangar. In the 143 update, we added around 25 airplanes for all playable nations.
Content in large amounts is something that should be introduced after a stable framework has been established. The more stuff you add into a game like this, the higher the chances are all sorts of balancing mishaps will occur, particularly power creep, which is something that even the most successful free-to-play companies struggle to keep from overwhelming the meta of their game. It's problematic how to approach this situation though, since War Thunder is a game that is advertised mainly off of emotional appeal. Despite having a label of being in an open beta, it's treated just like any other free-to-play title out there on the market. So of course, players are going to go through the progression system, get to certain vehicles, and grow attachments to them, and then get in a massive hissy fit whenever someone suggests a nerf, or suggests consulting blueprint or prototype Axis designs to make sure that the late tier Axis nations are actually fun to play at those tiers. And being fun to play is something that you have to take care with when designing a historical game. That is something I do get. War Thunder straddles a line between simulator games and arcade-style ones in that it focuses on exploring the conflicts of the mid-20th century on a grand scale, but also in a manner that is accessible for just about anyone. However, another problem arises in the way that those different communities are handled. Gaijin has taken a right step in saying that they will adjust the matchmaking system for historical battles. Such changes are fitting for a historical game. After all, the title of the game mode says realistic battles, and the simulator battles function follows the same mission structure. If one is looking for realism in arcade battles, however, they're in the wrong place. American, German, British, Japanese, and Russian tech didn't all fly with and against each other during the 20th century, so any kind of attempt to focus on a realistic tiering system, in my opinion, for that type of game mode, isn't really important. There's nothing wrong with fiddling around with it a bit and creating arcade as a separate mode, with tiering that focuses solely on tech efficiency rather than who faced who. However, that becomes progressively difficult when planes like the Yak-1 and Focke-Wulf A4 are added without much consideration. Going over to historical battles reveals additional problems, mainly in the mission structure. You have all these maps and missions that are structured around plausible historical events, or events that actually did take place during those various conflicts. Some events have very specific types of planes and only flew during those particular battles. However, those events also include outlandishly difficult objectives in certain points, thereby diminishing the role of bombers and attacker aircraft altogether, and basically making these games into glorified death matches. Who the hell is going to fly a strategic bomber on their own to try and complete a ground target objective? Nobody who has any idea what they're getting into. It's different when the mission is set up in a way that actually made sense. Like Guardian Angel. Everything here, for the most part, checks out. I would argue that the P-47 was not a widely used bomber escort in the latter stages of the war, but the premise of high-altitude American fighters escorting a formation of B-17s to destroy an objective makes sense. The German team's objective is to shoot down the bombers and make sure their objective does not get destroyed. A very clear fail and win state for both teams. America blows up stuff, they win, Germany loses. America doesn't blow up stuff, they lose. Germany wins. Vice versa. Going through some of the single-player missions that Gaijin has included in War Thunder leaves me absolutely flabbergasted as to why they haven't done more with them in the context of multiplayer games. You have tons of material here that just isn't being used. I'm willing to bet that if more missions were set up in this kind of manner to be available for play in both realistic and simulator battles, the player count for those modes would skyrocket. Yet again, Gaijin seems more interested in adding more and more stuff to the game rather than taking a look at things like this. So at the end of the day, with all this content being added, some of it being unfinished and a lot of it not really given a place in anything but arcade battles to derp around in, what would a player rather have? I think it's perfectly logical to say that if there was less of an emphasis on filling out these release trees as fast as possible, and more of an emphasis on taking as much time as necessary, fleshing out structural things that will keep the game aloft, the player base would not be so toxic and bitter both with Gaijin and with each other. mod support was a step in the right direction. Many of the new maps being put together show promise, but again, a game like this has to have structure. There is a lot of potential here. Beautiful graphics, sound design, and many other artistic elements that no other game out there in the market can match right now. Make this one of the highest quality games out there in terms of production, but not in execution, unfortunately. There are several games out there that have stood the test of time for being relatively simple at the core, but having a large degree of depth to explore. Take chess, StarCraft, League of Legends, most athletic sports games out there, on and on. Usually the formula of keep it simple, stupid works. To answer my previous question of what would players rather have, I think that question is answered in games like IL-2 Sturmovik Battle of Stalingrad. There aren't that many planes in comparison, but that's because it focuses on one particular conflict. A good amount of detail and care is put into these planes, giving them their own unique characteristics and niche roles that existed in reality, will go a long way. Rather than spreading focus out onto multiple aspects of the game at a time, maybe if Gaijin just slowed down for a bit, maybe if they just eased the gas, they could go a long way in making War Thunder an appealing game. Surely, it'll be around for some time now. I just hope that Gaijin doesn't have to give up the project because of these problems anytime soon. Thank you for watching, and I hope what I've had to say has some kind of insight to it.